The winter of 1878 came early to Dust Rock, Colorado. By late October, the first snow had already dusted the peaks of the Rocky Mountains that loomed over the small frontier town like ancient sentinels. The morning fog rolled down from the heights, wrapping the wooden buildings and muddy streets in a shroud of gray that wouldn't lift until well past noon. Elizabeth Whitlow stood at the parsonage window, watching the mist swirl past the glass. Her breath fogged the pane as she leaned close, creating a small circle of opacity that she absently wiped away with her sleeve. Behind her, the floorboards creaked under her father's heavy footsteps. Elizabeth, Reverend Josiah Whitlow's voice carried the weight of Scripture even in simple address. "Have you prepared for this morning's Sunday school lesson?" "Yes, Father." She didn't turn from the window. Somewhere out there, beyond the fog, the world stretched wide and wild. But here, within these walls, life moved in prescribed patterns: prayer, duty, obedience. "See that you emphasize the importance of purity," her father continued, settling into his chair with his worn Bible. "These frontier children need strong moral guidance. The wilderness breeds sin like a festering wound breeds corruption." Beth's fingers tightened on the windowsill. 6 months had passed since consumption took her mother, leaving behind an emptiness that no amount of prayer seemed to fill. Martha Whitlow had been the gentle buffer between father and daughter, the one who could soften his rigid edges with a touch or a quiet word. Now there was only the hard surface of his righteousness, polished smooth by years of thunderous sermons. "I'll make sure they understand," Beth said, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. The church bell tolled, its bronze voice cutting through the morning stillness. Beth gathered her shawl and stepped out into the cold, her breath visible in small puffs that dissipated quickly in the mountain air. The Methodist church sat at the center of town, its white steeple pointing accusingly at heaven. Around it, dust rocks sprawled in rough clusters: the general store, the blacksmith, the saloon her father preached against every Sunday, and the stage depot where mail and supplies arrived twice weekly. As she crossed the rutted street, a commotion near the depot caught her attention. A freight wagon had collided with the mail rider's horse, sending packages scattering across the mud. The rider, a man she'd never seen before, was cursing steadily as he gathered the spilled mail, his left hand bleeding from a gash across the palm. Without thinking, Beth hurried over. "You're hurt," she said, kneeling beside him despite the mud soaking through her skirts. The man looked up, and she found herself staring into eyes the color of winter storm clouds. His face was weathered beyond his years, a thick beard covering the lower half, and there was something in his gaze that spoke of distances traveled and things best forgotten. "It's nothing," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Had worse. Nevertheless, it needs tending." Beth pulled a clean handkerchief from her pocket. "Hold still." He watched her with those unsettling eyes as she wrapped his hand, his stillness absolute except for the slight tension in his jaw. Up close, she could smell leather and tobacco and something else, the scent of snow and pine, of places untouched by civilization. "You're the Reverend's daughter," he said. It wasn't a question. "Elizabeth Whitlow." She tied off the makeshift bandage. "And you are?" "Caleb Riker." He flexed his wrapped hand experimentally. "Mail carrier for the mountain route. I haven't seen you in church." A bitter smile touched his lips. "Your God and I parted ways at Antietam Creek." Beth had heard of Antietam, where the Potomac had run red with blood and 23,000 men had fallen in a single day. She said nothing, but something in her expression must have softened because his smile became less harsh. "Thank you for the bandage, Miss Whitlow." "Beth," she said impulsively, then immediately regretted it. Unmarried women didn't invite such familiarity from strange men. He stood, towering over her, and touched the brim of his hat. "Beth," the way he said her name, low and careful, sent an unfamiliar shiver through her. She watched him gather the remaining mail, mount his horse with practiced ease despite his injured hand, and ride toward the edge of town where the mountain trail began. "Elizabeth," Her father's voice cracked like a whip. "What are you doing?" She turned to find him standing on the church steps, his black coat making him look like a carrion bird against the white building. "A man was injured. Father, I saw what you were doing, kneeling in the mud like a common—" He stopped himself, but his meaning was clear. "That man is Caleb Riker. They say he killed 3 men in Kansas. Some say more. He needed help. He needs salvation, but he's made it clear he wants no part of it. You're to have no further contact with him. Is that understood?" "Yes, Father." But as Beth followed him into the church, she couldn't stop thinking about storm-cloud eyes and the careful way Caleb Riker had said her name, in the Sunday school room, surrounded by fidgeting children and the smell of chalk and old wood. She taught them about purity and virtue and the importance of keeping oneself unstained by the world. Yet her mind kept drifting to the blood on his hand, the gentleness with which he'd let her tend him, and the weight of Antietam in his voice. That afternoon, the fog finally lifted, revealing the mountains in all their harsh beauty. Beth stood at the same window, watching the sun gild the peaks gold and crimson. Somewhere up there, Caleb Riker was picking his way along treacherous paths, carrying letters and parcels to isolated camps and mining towns. What kind of man chose such a life? What drove him to seek solitude in those heights? Elizabeth, her father again, holding a letter. "Wonderful news. Reverend Patterson from Denver has agreed to visit next month. His son David is seeking a wife, a proper minister's wife who understands duty and righteousness." Beth's stomach clenched. She'd met David Patterson once at a church conference. Young, pale, with soft hands and a voice that mimicked his father's thunderous delivery without understanding the passion behind it. He'd looked at her the way a man might assess livestock at market. "I'm sure he's a fine man," she managed. "He is exactly what you need, a steady, godly influence to guide you in establishing a proper Christian household." Her father's smile was satisfied. "We'll announce the courtship when they arrive." That night, Beth lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent except for the wind rattling the windows and her father's occasional snores from down the hall. She thought about her mother, who had married at 17 and spent 23 years keeping house and keeping quiet. Martha Whitlow had died without ever seeing the ocean she'd dreamed about as a girl, without ever traveling beyond the boundaries of whatever town her husband's calling had taken them to. Beth rose and crept to the window. The moon was full, casting silver light across the snow-dusted ground. In the distance, she could see the dark line where the mountain trail began its ascent. Somewhere beyond that point, Caleb Riker made his solitary way through the wilderness, carrying other people's words of love and loss and longing. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and wondered what it would feel like to simply walk out the door and keep walking until the town was just a memory and the mountains opened their secrets to her. The thought was so foreign, so forbidden, that it took her breath away. Good daughters didn't have such thoughts. Good daughters accepted their fate with grace and gratitude. But as she returned to her bed, Beth couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted with the collision of that wagon and horse, with the blood and the bandage and the careful speaking of her name. The winter was coming. Yes, but beneath the approaching cold, something else stirred, something wild and dangerous and utterly contrary to everything she'd been taught to be. In the morning, she would rise and teach and pray and be the daughter her father expected. But tonight, in the darkness of her room with the mountains watching through her window, Elizabeth Whitlow allowed herself to imagine what it might mean to be something else entirely. The weeks that followed brought Caleb Riker through Dust Rock twice more. Each time, Beth found herself drawn to the window at the sound of hoofbeats, watching as he delivered mail at the depot before disappearing again into the mountains. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a man accustomed to solitude, never lingering, never seeking conversation. But she noticed things, the way he favored his right leg on cold mornings, suggesting an old injury, how he always checked the church doors as he passed, not with reverence but with the wariness of a man mapping escape routes. the careful distance he maintained from the townspeople who whispered about him behind raised hands. "You're wool-gathering again. Elizabeth, Mrs. Prudence Harper, the banker's wife," rapped her knuckles on the table. The church's Ladies' Aid Society met every Wednesday to sew quilts for the poor and gossip about their neighbors in equal measure. "My apologies," Beth murmured, returning her attention to her needlework. "I was saying that the Riker man brought news from Silver Creek. The Donnelly mine collapsed. 3 men dead. Mrs. Harper's needle flashed in the lamplight. Of course, a man like that would be drawn to tales of death. Perhaps he's simply performing his duty," Beth said quietly. "Bringing news, whether good or ill, is part of his work." The other women exchanged glances. "You always were too charitable, dear," said Mrs. Abigail Foster. "But you must be careful. A woman's reputation is like fine china. Once cracked, it can never be made whole again." That evening, Beth escaped to the small stable behind the parsonage under the pretense of checking on their old mare. The December air bit at her cheeks, but she welcomed the cold after the stifling warmth of the parlor. She was measuring out oats when she heard footsteps on the frozen ground. Caleb Riker stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light. "Miss Whitlow." Her heart stuttered. "Mr. Riker, what are you—" "Your father asked me to deliver this directly." He held out a letter bearing the Denver postmark. Said it was important. She took the letter, their fingers briefly touching. Even through her gloves, she felt the contact like a spark. "From Reverend Patterson," she said, recognizing the handwriting. "About his son's visit, the minister's boy who's courting you." It wasn't a question. Of course, the town gossip had reached even him. "It's not a courtship, not yet. But it will be." She looked up at him, searching for mockery or judgment in his face, but found only that steady, gray gaze. "My father believes it's a suitable match." "What do you believe?" No one had ever asked her that. Not about David Patterson. Not about anything that truly mattered. The question hung between them in the cold air, dangerous in its simplicity. "I believe—" She stopped, started again. "I believe duty and desire rarely walk the same path." Something shifted in his expression. A recognition, perhaps. He stepped closer, and she caught that scent again, leather and winter wind. "Duty's a cold bedfellow, Miss Whitlow." Speaking from experience, "I did my duty for 4 years, wore the blue uniform, fought for the Union, followed orders." His jaw tightened. "Watched boys younger than your Sunday school students die in muddy fields for reasons they couldn't even spell. Duty asks everything and gives nothing back but a clear conscience, and sometimes not even that." The pain in his voice was raw, unguarded. Without thinking, Beth reached out, her hand coming to rest on his arm. She felt the tension in his muscles, the way he held himself still as if movement might shatter something fragile. "Is that why you came west? To escape duty?" "Came west to escape myself." He looked down at her hand on his arm, but didn't pull away. "Turns out you can't outrun what's inside your own head. The mountains just give it more room to echo. You must be lonely. Lonely's not the worst thing a man can be." "What is?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Forgiven by everyone except himself." The stable was growing dark, the last light fading from the sky. Beth knew she should go inside, knew her father would be looking for her soon. But something held her there, some invisible thread between her hand on his arm and the wounded honesty in his voice. "My mother used to say that God's forgiveness is like snow," she said softly. "It covers everything, makes it clean and new." Pretty words. His smile was sad. "But snow melts, Miss Whitlow, and what's underneath is still what it always was." He stepped back, gently breaking the contact. "You should go inside. Your reputation won't survive being found here with me after dark." She wanted to protest, to say she didn't care about her reputation. But the words wouldn't come. He was right, of course. She was the minister's daughter, bound by rules as surely as if they were written on her skin. As she turned to go, he spoke again. "That Patterson boy, he doesn't deserve you." She looked back. You don't know him. I know his type. Soft hands and memorized scripture. He'll cage you in propriety and call it love. Caleb's eyes were intense in the gathering darkness. You're not meant for cages, Beth. The use of her given name sent heat through her despite the cold. And what am I meant for, Mr. Riker? Something wider than these town limits. Something that doesn't require you to make yourself smaller to fit inside it. She fled then, clutching the letter, her heart pounding with more than exertion. Behind her, she felt him watching until she disappeared into the house. That night, her father read the Patterson letter aloud at dinner, his voice full of satisfaction. David would arrive the week before Christmas, accompanied by his parents. The formal courtship would begin then, with a wedding planned for spring. 6 months should be sufficient for you to prepare. Her father said, Mrs. Patterson will instruct you in managing a minister's household. David speaks highly of your moral character and modest bearing. Beth pushed food around her plate, thinking of cages and snow and the way Caleb Riker said her name like it meant something more than ownership. The next Sunday's sermon was on temptation. Her father's voice thundered through the church, warning against the serpent that came in pleasing guises, offering freedom that was really bondage, promising pleasure that led only to damnation. Beth sat in the front pew, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the cross above the altar, but her mind wandered to mountain trails and solitary riders and the terrible freedom of having nothing left to lose. After the service, as she helped clear the communion plates, young Tom Morrison burst through the doors. Fire at the Hendricks place. The barn's going up. The congregation scattered, men running to help fight the blaze. Beth followed, her father's shouts to stay put lost in the chaos. By the time she reached the Hendricks farm on the town's edge, the barn was fully engulfed, flames leaping toward the winter sky. She joined the bucket brigade, passing water hand over hand. Smoke stung her eyes, and the heat was overwhelming despite the cold day. Then she saw him, Caleb, shirtless despite the December air, leading horses from the burning structure. His back was covered in scars, a map of old violence written in raised white tissue. He emerged with the last mare just as part of the roof collapsed. Someone threw a blanket around his shoulders, but not before Beth had seen the full extent of the damage war had written on his body. Their eyes met across the chaos. In that moment, with ash falling like snow and the world burning bright around them, she understood something fundamental. They were both scarred, both marked by different kinds of violence. His were visible, carved in flesh. Hers were hidden, etched on her spirit by years of being shaped into something smaller than her soul. The fire was controlled, the house saved. As people began to drift away, Beth found herself walking toward the edge of the gathering, where Caleb stood apart, pulling his shirt back on. "Thank you," she said simply, "for saving the horses." He studied her face, reading something there that made him frown. "You have ash in your hair." She reached up self-consciously, and he caught her wrist gently. "Here." He brushed the ash away with careful fingers, the touch sending shivers through her. "Elizabeth!" Her father's voice cut through the moment like an axe through wood. "Come away from there at once." She stepped back, but not before Caleb murmured, "Remember what I said about cages. Beth, some doors only lock from the inside." As her father led her away, lecturing about proper behavior and the dangers of associating with disreputable men, Beth felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The carefully constructed walls of her life suddenly seemed as fragile as the Hendricks barn, ready to collapse at the first spark. Christmas was coming, and with it, David Patterson and his plans for her future. But between now and then stretched 2 weeks of winter darkness, and in that darkness, Beth began to imagine impossible things. Freedom, choice, a life written in her own hand rather than copied from someone else's scripture. And at the center of those imaginings, like a fixed star in her spinning sky, were storm-gray eyes that saw her not as she was supposed to be, but as she truly was, wild and yearning and absolutely unfit for the narrow life closing in around her. The fire at the church storehouse started just after midnight on December 20th. Beth woke to the clanging of bells and shouts in the street. From her window, she could see orange flames licking at the wooden structure where the church kept supplies for the poor: flour, blankets, preserved foods meant to see desperate families through the harsh winter. She dressed quickly and rushed downstairs, finding her father already gone. The entire town seemed to be converging on the scene. By the time she arrived, the building was beyond saving, black smoke billowing into the star-filled sky. "Stand back, Miss Whitlow." Sheriff Wallace gripped her arm. Nothing to be done now but let it burn itself out. Beth watched in horror as months of charitable donations turned to ash. Around her, townspeople muttered about sparks from the chimney, faulty lamp oil, the dry winter air. But when dawn finally broke over the smoldering ruins, the talk turned darker. "Found this." Deputy Morrison held up a half-burned book, one of the primers Beth used for teaching, right by where the fire started. "That's mine," Beth said, stepping forward. "But I keep them in the church, not the storehouse." "What were you doing near here last night?" The sheriff's eyes were hard. "Nothing. I was home, asleep." "Anyone vouch for that?" "My father, who was at the deacon's house until past 11. Sheriff Wallace turned the book over in his hands. "Mighty convenient, finding your belongings at the scene." The crowd began to murmur. Beth felt their stares like physical weight. "Mrs." Harper whispered something to Mrs. Foster, both women shaking their heads. "This is absurd," Beth protested. "Why would I burn our own storehouse?" "Been acting strange lately," someone called out. "Seen her talking with that Riker fellow." "Maybe he put her up to it," another voice suggested. "Everyone knows he's got no love for the church." Her father pushed through the crowd, his face grave. "Elizabeth, come home, now." But the damage was done. By afternoon, the story had twisted and grown. Beth had been seen near the storehouse? False. She'd been meeting secretly with Caleb Riker, only partly true. She'd grown rebellious since her mother's death, questioning scripture, resenting her upcoming marriage, truer than anyone knew. That evening, her father sat across from her in his study, hands folded like he was praying for wisdom. "I've managed to prevent formal charges," he said heavily. Sheriff Wallace agreed to investigate further, but Elizabeth... He looked older than she'd ever seen him. "The suspicion alone is enough to ruin you. To ruin us both." "I didn't do it. Father!" "I know that, but perception matters more than truth in situations like this." He rubbed his temples. "The Pattersons have withdrawn their visit. David feels it would be inappropriate to pursue a courtship under these circumstances." Beth felt a wild urge to laugh. The cage door had swung open, but only because the cage itself was burning down around her. "There's a convent in Santa Fe," her father continued. "The Sisters of Mercy. They take in young women who need reflection and guidance. 6 months there would let this scandal die down. When you return, we'll find another match, perhaps in a different town. You're sending me away? I'm saving you, Elizabeth. From yourself, if necessary." His voice hardened. "You'll leave after Christmas. The sisters will teach you proper submission to God's will." That night, Beth lay awake planning. She had 5 days before her exile. 5 days to prove her innocence or accept her fate. As the hours crawled toward dawn, she made her choice. The next evening, she waited until her father left for prayer meeting, then slipped out the back door. The temperature had dropped, and fresh snow was beginning to fall. She pulled her mother's old cloak tight around her shoulders and made her way to the edge of town, where a shabby boarding house served the transient workers and travelers. She'd never been inside, but she knew Caleb kept a room there between his mountain runs. The proprietor, a weathered woman named Maggie Quinn, looked her up and down with knowing eyes. "He's in room 4. Honey, but you didn't hear it from me." Beth climbed the narrow stairs, her heart hammering. At the door, she hesitated, then knocked softly. Caleb answered immediately, as if he'd been expecting someone. His eyes widened when he saw her. "Beth!" Christ, what are you doing here? I need your help. The words tumbled out in a rush. They think I burned the storehouse. Father's sending me to a convent. I have nowhere else to turn. He pulled her inside, checking the hallway before closing the door. The room was sparse. A narrow bed, a chair, his saddlebags in the corner. A rifle leaned against the wall. Tell me everything. She did, watching his face darken as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You want me to find who really did it? No. She took a deep breath. I want you to take me away from here, just for a few days. Let me think. Let me breathe. I'll pay you. Stop. His voice was rough. You don't know what you're asking. I'm asking for help from the only person in this town who looks at me and sees something more than the minister's daughter. And what happens when we come back? Your reputation is already ruined. She stepped closer, desperate. Please, Caleb, I've never asked anything for myself, never chosen anything for myself. Let me choose this. He studied her face, and she saw the moment his resolve weakened. One night, he said finally, there's a way station about 15 miles north, in the foothills. We could make it there and back by morning. Give you time to think, but Beth... He caught her shoulders, his grip firm. This isn't a game. The weather's turning bad. The trail is dangerous, and if we're seen... I understand. Do you? His eyes searched hers. Because once we leave town together, there's no taking it back. Whatever innocence you have left... Innocence? She laughed bitterly. I'm already condemned. What's left to lose? He was silent for a moment, then moved to his saddlebags. You'll need warmer clothes. Can you ride? Yes. Good. We leave in an hour. Go home, gather what you need. Then meet me at the old mine road. If you change your mind, I won't. She turned to go, but he caught her arm. Beth, are you sure this isn't really about running from something? She looked back at him, letting him see all the desperation and determination inside her. Maybe it is, but sometimes running toward and running from look the same in the dark. The hour passed in a blur. Beth packed a small bag, left a note for her father claiming she was staying with the widow Brown to help with her sick grandchild. A lie that would be discovered by morning, but by then she'd be beyond reach. She found Caleb waiting with 2 horses at the abandoned mine road. Snow was falling steadily now, already covering their tracks. He'd brought an extra coat, thick gloves, a scarf to wrap around her face. Last chance, he said as he helped her mount. Instead of answering, she urged her horse forward, into the swirling snow and darkness. Behind them, Dust Rock's lights grew dim and disappeared. Ahead lay the mountains, vast and indifferent, offering no judgment, no forgiveness, only the terrible freedom of the unknown. They rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the muffled thud of hooves in snow. Beth had never been this far from town, never been alone with a man who wasn't her father, never done anything so utterly beyond redemption. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something wild and fierce rising in her chest, like a bird finally remembering it had wings. Beside her, Caleb rode with the easy confidence of a man who belonged to these mountains. She wondered what he was thinking, why he'd agreed to this madness. Was it pity, some twisted desire to corrupt the minister's daughter? Or did he recognize in her the same brokenness that lived in him, the need to shatter what remained of yourself rather than let others do it for you? The snow grew heavier, the wind picking up. Beth's face went numb despite the scarf, her fingers stiff inside the gloves. But she didn't complain, didn't ask to stop. This cold, this discomfort, it was real in a way that nothing in her life had been for months. It demanded her full attention, left no room for doubt or regret. Not much farther, Caleb called over the wind. Through the driving snow, she glimpsed a dark shape. The way station, little more than a cabin built into the mountainside. As they approached, Beth felt the last of her old life fall away like a discarded cloak. Elizabeth Whitlow, the dutiful daughter, the proper Christian girl, the suitable bride, she left her behind in the snow. What remained was just Beth, cold and afraid and absolutely certain that whatever happened next, she had finally truly chosen it for herself. The cabin was cold and musty, abandoned since the last mail rider had used it weeks ago. Caleb worked quickly to stable the horses while Beth stood in the doorway, shaking snow from her cloak. Her whole body trembled. From cold, from fear, from the magnitude of what she'd done. "Get inside," Caleb said, carrying in their saddlebags. "I'll start a fire." The single room held only the basics: a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed with a straw mattress. Beth busied herself lighting the oil lamp while Caleb coaxed life from the cold hearth. Neither spoke as the fire caught, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Once the room began to warm, an awkward silence settled between them. They stood on opposite sides of the small space, the bed looming between them like an unspoken question. "You can have the bed," Caleb said finally. "I'll take the floor." "That's not necessary. I mean—" Beth felt heat rise in her cheeks. "We can share. For warmth. Nothing more." He studied her carefully. "Beth, you need to understand something. What happened tonight, leaving town with me? It's already damning enough. But if anything else—" "I know." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not a child." "Caleb." "No," he said quietly. "You're not." They prepared for sleep in careful, deliberate movements. Beth kept her dress on, merely loosening the stays and removing her boots. Caleb stripped to his shirt and trousers, the firelight revealing more scars along his arms. They lay down with careful distance between them, backs turned, the wind howling outside, but sleep wouldn't come. Beth stared at the rough wall, hyper-aware of every sound, the pop of the fire, the creak of the mattress, Caleb's breathing. After what felt like hours, she heard him shift restlessly. "Can't sleep either," she whispered. "No." She rolled onto her back, staring at the ceiling. "Tell me about the war." "You don't want to hear about that. I want to understand. The scars, Antietam. What made you stop believing?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I was 19 when I enlisted. Thought I was fighting for something righteous. Freedom for the slaves. Preservation of the Union. Noble causes." His voice was hollow. "First battle. I shot a boy who couldn't have been more than 16. Confederate uniform. But his eyes, Christ, his eyes were just like my brother's. Scared. Young. He called for his mother as he died." Beth turned toward him instinctively, finding him on his back as well, staring at nothing. After that, it was just survival. Kill or be killed. No nobility in it, just mud and blood and counting the days until it ended. He shifted, and she saw his profile in the firelight. "At Antietam, my unit was caught in the cornfield. 23,000 casualties in 12 hours. I lay under dead bodies for half a day, pretending to be one of them, listening to men cry and pray and curse God with their last breaths." "How did you survive it?" "By becoming something else. Something that could do terrible things and keep breathing." His laugh was bitter. "Your father would say I lost my soul. Maybe he's right." Without thinking, Beth reached across the space between them, her hand finding his. He went very still. "I don't think souls can be lost," she said softly. "Only buried, under pain, under choices we wish we hadn't made. But they're still there, waiting." His hand turned, fingers interlacing with hers. "You really believe that?" "I have to. Otherwise, what hope is there for any of us?" They lay in silence, hands clasped between them like a bridge. The fire burned lower, the room growing cold again. Beth shivered, and Caleb pulled her closer without a word. She curved into his warmth, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder. "This is dangerous," he murmured into her hair. "I know." His arm tightened around her. She could feel his heart beating under her palm, quick and unsteady. The space between them hummed with possibility, with everything they weren't saying, weren't doing. "Beth," her name was barely a breath, "you deserve better than—" She lifted her head, silencing him with a look. In the dying firelight, His eyes were vast and dark, full of want and fear in equal measure. She'd never seen anyone look at her the way he was looking at her now, like she was something precious and terrible at once. The first kiss was tentative, a question more than a statement. His lips were surprisingly soft, gentle in a way that made her chest ache. She'd imagined kissing before, but her imagination had been a pale thing compared to this. The heat of his mouth, the scratch of his beard, the way his hand came up to cradle her face like she might break. When they parted, both breathing unsteadily, Beth felt something fundamental shift inside her. All her life, she'd been told that desire was dangerous, that a woman's wants were the gateway to ruin. But this didn't feel like ruin. It felt like waking up. "I don't want to be good tonight," she whispered, echoing words she'd only thought but never dared speak. "I've been good my whole life, and where has it gotten me? Accused, exiled, bartered like property." She pressed closer, feeling him tremble. "For once, I want to choose something for myself. I choose this. I choose you." "Beth," his voice was strained, "you don't know what you're asking. Tomorrow I'll go to the convent or face worse. Tomorrow my life becomes someone else's again." She traced the line of his jaw, feeling him lean into her touch. "But tonight is mine. Let me have tonight." He searched her face in the dimness, and she let him see everything. The need, the certainty, the fierce determination to claim this one thing for herself before it was too late. Whatever he found there must have broken his last resistance, because he pulled her against him with a groan that might have been surrender or salvation. The second kiss was different, deeper, hungrier. Beth's hands found their way under his shirt, tracing the map of scars across his back. He shuddered at her touch, breaking the kiss to trail his lips down her throat. She arched against him, a sound escaping her that would have mortified her in daylight, but here, in this stolen darkness, felt like freedom. They moved together with increasing urgency, clothes loosening, falling away, when Caleb pulled back, his hands shaking as he unlaced her corset. She helped him, impatient with the barriers between them. The cold air against her skin made her gasp, but then his warmth covered her, and she forgot about cold, forgot about tomorrow, forgot everything but the weight of him and the way he whispered her name like a prayer. "Are you certain?" he asked one last time, poised above her, his control visible in the tension of his shoulders. Instead of answering with words, she pulled him down, crossing the last boundary between what she had been and what she was becoming. The initial discomfort was brief, overwhelmed by the intensity of finally, truly choosing, of being chosen in return. They moved together in the darkness, finding a rhythm as old as the mountains surrounding them. Beth understood now why this was forbidden, why they built so many walls around it. Not because it was evil, but because it was powerful, transformative. Once you knew you could feel this way, how could you ever go back to accepting less? When release came, it was like breaking through ice into shocking, brilliant life. She muffled her cry against Caleb's shoulder, feeling him shudder and still above her, his face buried in her hair. They lay entwined afterward, the sweat cooling on their skin. Caleb pulled the rough blanket over them, his arms tight around her as if he could hold back the dawn through will alone. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. Beth considered, taking inventory of herself. She felt changed, yes, marked by this choice in ways that went beyond the physical, but regretful? "No," she said firmly. "Never." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, and she felt him smile against her skin. "My wild Beth, what have we done?" "We've lived," she said simply. "For one night, we've lived." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside their small shelter, there was warmth and skin and the quiet breathing of two people who had found, in each other, a momentary escape from the cages that held them. Tomorrow would come with all its consequences, but tonight was theirs, and that was enough. Dawn came gray and bitter, the storm having passed but leaving 2 feet of fresh snow in its wake. Beth woke to find Caleb already up, feeding the fire and melting snow for water. The sight of him moving quietly about the cabin, careful not to wake her, made something tender bloom in her chest. "Morning," she said softly. He turned, his expression unreadable. "Storm's passed. We need to move soon if—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "Beth, about last night—" "Don't!" She sat up, holding the blanket around her shoulders. "Please don't apologize or tell me it was a mistake. I couldn't bear it." He crossed to her in 2 strides, kneeling beside the bed. "I wasn't going to apologize. I was going to say that last night was—" He touched her face gently. "I've done many things I regret, but this won't ever be one of them." They prepared to leave in companionable silence, sharing the meager supplies Caleb had brought. He taught her how to bank the fire properly, how to read the weather signs in the clouds. Small things, practical things. But Beth treasured each lesson like a gift. This was knowledge born of experience, not scripture. "We can't go back to Dust Rock," Caleb said as they saddled the horses. "Not together. The scandal—" "I know." Beth had been thinking about this through the night. "Take me to Broken Rock instead. I have a cousin there who might take me in, at least temporarily." "That's 3 days' ride in good weather. In this snow? Then we'd better get started." He studied her face. "You're not the same woman who knocked on my door last night." "No," she agreed. "I'm not." They set out into a world transformed by snow. The familiar landmarks were obscured. Everything made new and strange by the white blanket. Beth found it fitting. She too had been transformed, made new by the choices of the night. The going was slow, the horses struggling through deep drifts. By midday, they'd covered barely 5 miles. Caleb called a halt in a grove of pines, their branches heavy with snow. "We need to rest the horses," he said, helping her dismount. Her legs nearly buckled, sore from riding and from— She felt heat rise in her cheeks at the memory. They shared dried beef and hard biscuit, melting snow to drink. Beth watched Caleb scan their surroundings constantly, alert for danger even in this seeming peace. "Teach me," she said suddenly. "What?" "How to survive out here, how to read the land, find shelter, make fire." She met his surprised look steadily. "I'm tired of being helpless." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, perhaps. "All right, first lesson. Always know where you are in relation to water. Streams run downhill, eventually lead to rivers. Rivers lead to towns." They spent the afternoon like that, Caleb teaching and Beth absorbing everything with hungry intensity. He showed her how to find dry wood under snow, how to tell direction by the moss on trees, how to recognize the signs of an approaching storm. "You're a quick study," he said, as she successfully started a fire using his flint and steel. "I've had a good teacher." She looked up at him through her lashes, saw the way his jaw tightened. The attraction between them hadn't dimmed with daylight. If anything, it had intensified. That night they sheltered in a cave Caleb knew about, little more than a hollow in the rock but dry and protected from the wind. They built their fire close to the entrance for ventilation, spreading their bedrolls near each other without discussion. "Tell me about your mother," Caleb said as they lay watching the flames. Beth smiled sadly. "She was everything my father isn't. Warm, laughing, full of stories. She grew up in Boston, came from money, but fell in love with a young minister and followed him west." She paused. "I think she regretted it sometimes. Not the love, but the life it led to. The constraints." "Is that why you're so determined not to follow her path?" "Partly, but mostly because I watched her fade, year by year. Every move to a smaller town, every sermon about wifely submission, every day of keeping house and keeping quiet. It dimmed her light a little more." Beth's voice caught. "When she was dying, she told me to be brave. I thought she meant brave in accepting God's will. Now I think she meant brave enough to refuse it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "My mother would have liked you," he said finally. "She was brave too. Raised 3 boys alone after my father died. Kept the farm going through drought and hardship. Never remarried, though she had offers. Said she'd rather be alone than owned." "What happened to her?" died while I was at war. Pneumonia, my youngest brother wrote, but the letter didn't reach me until months later. His voice was steady, but Beth heard the old pain underneath. I never got to say goodbye, never got to tell her that everything I was trying to be, the honorable soldier, the good man, it was all for her. Beth reached for his hand in the darkness, lacing their fingers together. She knew. They lay in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the horses stamping occasionally outside. Despite the hard ground and the cold beyond their small circle of warmth, Beth felt more at peace than she had in months. "Sing for me," Caleb said suddenly. "What?" "You said you sang to your mother. I'd like to hear it." Self-conscious but willing, Beth began to sing an old lullaby her mother had taught her. Her voice echoed off the cave walls, sweet and clear. She felt Caleb relax beside her, his breathing deepening. When she finished, he was almost asleep. "Don't stop," he murmured. So she sang another song, and another, until his hand went slack in hers and she knew he slept. For the first time since Antietam, he'd said. She wondered how many nights he'd lain awake, haunted by ghosts only he could see. The third day brought new challenges. The temperature dropped sharply, and clouds gathered on the horizon, promising more snow. They pushed harder, both knowing they needed to reach shelter before the next storm hit. "There's a trading post about 10 miles ahead," Caleb said, consulting his mental map. "We can resupply there, maybe wait out the weather." But as they crested a ridge, they saw smoke rising in the distance. Too much smoke for a chimney. "Fire," Beth breathed. Caleb's face went grim. "Or raiders. Either way, we go around." The detour cost them precious time. By late afternoon, the snow had started again, and they were still miles from any known shelter. Beth's hands were numb on the reins, her body shaking with cold despite the layers Caleb had insisted she wear. "There," he pointed to a cluster of rocks. "We'll have to make camp." They worked together with increasing urgency, Beth following Caleb's terse instructions: build a windbreak with the horses, gather what dry wood they could find, create a small, efficient fire that would last through the night. By the time they had their meager camp established, Beth could barely feel her feet. Caleb pulled her against him, wrapping them both in every blanket they had. "Body heat," he said gruffly. "Best way to fight the cold." She pressed closer, feeling the solid warmth of him through their clothes. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "Of freezing, of this ending, of reaching Broken Rock and having to say goodbye." She lifted her head to look at him. "I know this can't last. I know you have your roots, and I have whatever life I can build from the ashes of my reputation. But Caleb..." He kissed her then, cutting off whatever she'd been about to say. When they parted, his eyes were fierce. "We're going to survive this night," he said. "And the next, and the next. Whatever comes after, we'll face it then. But right now, all that matters is keeping you warm and alive." She believed him, curled against him while the snow fell and the wind howled. Beth held tight to the present moment. They'd come so far from that first meeting over his bleeding hand. She was no longer the minister's daughter, and perhaps he was no longer the broken soldier. They were just two people choosing each other against all odds, against all wisdom. "Sing for me again," he said, his breath warm against her ear. So she did, her voice mixing with the wind, creating their own small world of warmth and music while the mountain winter raged around them. Tomorrow they'd reach Broken Rock. Tomorrow. Decisions would have to be made, but tonight they had each other, and that was enough to keep the cold at bay. They reached Broken Rock as the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, revealing a rough mining town carved into the mountainside. Larger than Dust Rock but twice as lawless, it sprawled along the canyon with saloons, gambling halls, and businesses catering to the streams of prospectors seeking their fortunes. "Stay close," Caleb murmured as they rode down the main street. "And keep your hood up." Beth understood. A woman traveling alone with a man who wasn't her husband would draw attention. The wrong kind. They stopped at McMurray's boarding house, where the proprietress, a stern Irish woman named Bridget McMurray, looked them over with sharp eyes. "Separate rooms," she stated more than asked. "Please," Beth said quietly. "And I'm looking for my cousin, Margaret Sawyer. Do you know where I might find her?" Mrs. McMurray's expression softened slightly. "Maggie Sawyer runs the bakery on 2nd Street. Good woman. You'll be her cousin from Colorado way?" "Yes, ma'am." "Well then." She handed over 2 keys. "Rooms 12 and 14. Hot water for washing is extra. No visitors after 9 o'clock. Her gaze lingered meaningfully on Caleb. They parted in the hallway, Caleb touching her hand briefly. "I'll find out about your cousin. Make sure it's safe. Rest. You need it." Alone in the small room, Beth finally let herself feel the exhaustion of the past days. She washed with the tepid water from the basin, changed into her one clean dress, and tried to make herself presentable. In the spotted mirror, a stranger looked back, wind-burned, hollow-eyed, but with a fierce aliveness she'd never seen in her own face before. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Caleb, his expression troubled. "Your cousin will see you, but Beth..." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "There's news from Dust Rock. A rider came through this morning." Her heart clenched. What kind of news? "They've arrested someone for the fire, Tom Morrison, the deputy's own son. Apparently, he was stealing from the storehouse to sell. Set the fire to cover his tracks." Beth sank onto the bed. "Then I'm cleared?" "Of arson, yes, but..." Caleb sat beside her, not touching. "Your father's put out word that you've been abducted. Says I took you against your will. There's a bounty. Beth, $50 for your safe return. 100 for me, dead or alive." The room spun. He couldn't. He's a desperate man trying to save face. His daughter running off with a man like me? Caleb's smile was bitter. "Better to paint you as victim than admit you chose to leave. We have to tell them the truth." "And what truth is that? That the minister's daughter fled town with a killer. That we've been..." He gestured between them. "Beth, the truth damns us both." She stood abruptly, pacing the small room. "So what do we do?" "You stay with your cousin. Build a new life here. I disappear into the mountains until this blows over." He rose, moving toward the door. "It's the only way." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "That's the coward's way." His shoulders tensed. "Careful, Beth. You're running. Just like you've been running since the war." She faced him, chin raised. "You think leaving me here, slinking off into your solitude, makes you noble? It makes you a coward." His eyes flashed dangerously. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I? Poor broken Caleb. Too damaged to let anyone close. It's easier to be alone, isn't it? No one to disappoint, no one to lose." Her voice cracked. "But I'm not asking you to save me. I'm asking you to stay." "For what?" He spread his hands. "To watch them drag you back? To get us both killed when some bounty hunter decides $100 is worth a bullet?" "For me," she said simply. "Stay for me." The anger drained from his face, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. "Beth." A commotion in the street below cut him off. They moved to the window, peering through the dusty curtains. A group of riders had gathered outside, rough men with the look of bounty hunters about them. "Word travels fast," Caleb muttered. He checked his revolver, an automatic gesture that made Beth's blood cold. "They're not here for trouble yet, just information, but it won't be long. Then we leave, together. And go where? I'm a wanted man now, and you am a woman who makes her own choices." She gripped his hands. "I have an idea, but you have to trust me." An hour later, Beth stood in her cousin Margaret's bakery. The smell of fresh bread, a painful reminder of simpler times. Margaret Sawyer was 10 years older than Beth, with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. "Elizabeth, when I heard you were in town..." She embraced Beth warmly, then held her at arm's length, studying her face. "Child, what's happened? Your father's letter said..." Father's letter was wrong. Beth chose her words carefully. Margaret, I need your help, not charity, not rescue. Help! Margaret glanced at where Caleb waited by the door, his presence filling the small shop. This is the man? His name is Caleb Riker. He saved my life. Beth met her cousin's gaze steadily. I love him. The simple declaration hung in the air. Margaret sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. Oh, Elizabeth, you always were too much like your mother, too much heart for your own good. Will you help us? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. There's a minister here, Father Miguel at the Spanish mission. He's understanding about certain matters, performs marriages when the circumstances are irregular. Beth's heart leaped. You mean marriage would change things legally, make it harder for your father to claim abduction? Not impossible, but harder. She looked between them. If that's what you truly want. Beth turned to Caleb, who stood frozen by the door. It's not how I imagined it, she said softly. But then, nothing about us has been conventional. Beth, you don't know what you're binding yourself to. I can't be the husband you deserve. I'm not asking you to be anything but yourself. She crossed to him, taking his face in her hands. But I am asking you to stop running. With me, from me. We face whatever comes together, or not at all. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. When he opened them again, she saw surrender there, and something that might have been hope. Together, he agreed roughly. Father Miguel was indeed understanding, an elderly priest who'd seen enough of life to know that love came in many forms, not all of them sanctioned by proper society. The ceremony was simple, witnessed by Margaret and the church's caretaker. Beth wore her travel-stained dress. Caleb had shaved, but still looked like what he was, a dangerous man making a desperate choice. Do you, Elizabeth, take this man freely and without reservation? Father Miguel asked in accented English. I do. The words came strong and clear. Do you, Caleb, take this woman freely and without reservation? Caleb's voice was rougher, but no less certain. I do. When Father Miguel pronounced them married, Caleb kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to Beth's eyes. She was no longer Elizabeth Whitlow, the minister's daughter. She was Beth Riker, wife of a wanted man, bound to an uncertain future. Outside the mission, the sun was setting over Broken Rock, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. Margaret had offered them the room above her bakery, just until you sort things out, and promised to send word to Dust Rock that Beth was safe and married. It won't stop the bounty hunters, Caleb warned as they climbed the stairs to their temporary refuge. Or your father's fury. I know. Beth turned in the doorway, looking back at him with eyes full of determination. But at least now we face it as husband and wife. No more running. Caleb, we make our stand here. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. My brave, foolish wife, what have you done? I've chosen, she said simply, and I'll keep choosing you every day, no matter what comes. As night fell over Broken Rock, they held each other in the small room above the bakery, planning their next moves. Word would reach Dust Rock soon. Her father would rage. Bounty hunters would come. But for now, they were together, bound by law and love and the fierce determination to forge a life on their own terms. Beth Riker Nee Whitlow had burned her bridges as surely as that storehouse had burned. But from the ashes, something new was rising. A future she couldn't yet see but was determined to claim, one choice at a time. The letter from Dust Rock arrived 3 weeks after their impromptu wedding. Margaret brought it up to their small room above the bakery, her face grave. Beth's hands trembled as she recognized her father's handwriting. Elizabeth, the letter began, not acknowledging her married name. Your willfulness has brought shame upon our family and God's house. But his mercy is infinite, as is mine. Return home immediately, and all will be forgiven. The marriage can be annulled. I have spoken with church authorities. David Patterson remains willing to honor his commitment once this scandal is resolved. Do not compound your sin with stubbornness. Deputy Morrison has been removed from office for his son's crimes. You are cleared of all suspicion and may return with dignity. Your father in Christ, Josiah Whitlow. Beth crumpled the letter, fury rising in her chest. Forgiven? As if I'm the one who needs forgiveness? Caleb took the letter, smoothing it out to read. His jaw tightened. He's trying to save face. Make it seem like you're returning by choice, not force. And David Patterson still willing. She laughed bitterly. As if I'm goods on a shelf, slightly damaged but still saleable. A knock interrupted them. Margaret peered in. There's someone downstairs asking for you. Beth says he's from Denver. They exchanged worried glances. Caleb reached for his gun, but Beth stopped him. Let me see who it is first. In the bakery below, a well-dressed man in his 50s waited, hat in hand. Mrs. Riker, my name is Charles Thornton. I'm a lawyer from Denver, hired by the territorial government to investigate certain irregularities in Dustrock. Beth's pulse quickened. What kind of irregularities? Misuse of church funds, false imprisonment, coercion. He produced a document. I've been collecting testimonies. Your case was brought to my attention by Father Miguel, who felt justice had been poorly served. Over the next hour, Thornton laid out his findings. Tom Morrison hadn't acted alone. David Patterson had been his accomplice, helping to steal from the church storehouse and planning to frame Beth to remove her as an obstacle to their scheme. The fire had been Patterson's idea when Morrison panicked. We have Morrison's confession, Thornton explained. He implicated Patterson in exchange for leniency, but Patterson fled when he heard you'd left town. Your father... He paused delicately. Your father refuses to believe his protégé's guilt. He maintains you corrupted both young men with your rebellious nature. Of course he does, Beth said quietly. However, with your testimony and the evidence we've gathered, we can clear your name completely. Will you return to Dustrock to give a formal statement? Beth looked at Caleb, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. Return to Dustrock? Face her father's rage, the town's judgment? I'll do it, she said firmly. But my husband comes with me. The bounty, Caleb started, has been rescinded. Thornton interrupted. I took the liberty of clarifying the situation with the territorial marshal. No crime was committed. You're both free to travel. 3 days later, they rode back into Dustrock. The town looked smaller than Beth remembered, meaner. People stopped in the streets to stare as they passed. The minister's daughter, who'd run off with the mail carrier, now returning as his wife. They went first to the sheriff's office, where Beth gave her statement. Sheriff Wallace, looking older and wearier, took it all down without meeting her eyes. Tom Morrison had already been sentenced to 2 years hard labor. David Patterson remained at large. Will you be staying in town? Wallace asked when they finished. No, Beth said firmly. We're only here to settle matters. Their next stop was inevitable. The parsonage looked exactly the same, but Beth felt like a stranger approaching her childhood home. Her father answered the door, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other. He'd aged years in weeks. His hair, once iron gray, had gone white at the temples. The rigid certainty that had always animated him seemed diminished, though his eyes still burned with conviction. Elizabeth. He didn't invite them in. I see you've brought your companion. My husband, Beth corrected. Father, we need to talk. There's nothing to discuss. You've made your choice. You've abandoned God's plan for your life. Thrown away your purity and your future for this. He gestured dismissively at Caleb. David Patterson was a thief and a liar, Beth said evenly. He tried to destroy me to cover his crimes. Is that the future you wanted for me? Lies spread by this man to justify his seduction of you. Her father's voice rose. You were pure, obedient, until he... I was dying, Beth interrupted. Slowly, quietly, but dying all the same, just like Mother. Her father flinched as if slapped. Do not invoke your mother's memory to justify your sin. Mother told me to be brave. I finally understand what she meant. Beth felt Caleb's steadying presence behind her. She meant brave enough to choose love over duty. Brave enough to live my own life, not the one prescribed for me. Love? Her father's laugh was harsh. You call this base attraction love? You know nothing of love. Love is sacrifice, submission, putting aside your own desires for God's will. No, Beth said quietly. That's fear. Love is choosing each other every day, despite the difficulties. Love is seeing someone's brokenness and staying anyway. Love is... She reached back, finding Caleb's hand. Love is freedom. Father, something you never let Mother have. Get out. Her father's voice was deadly quiet. You are no daughter of mine. Your mother would be ashamed. My mother would be proud, Beth said, surprised to find her eyes dry. Goodbye, Father. I pray someday you find the peace that's eluded you all these years. They left the parsonage for the last time. Beth didn't look back, though she heard the door slam with finality behind them. As they walked toward their horses, Mrs. Harper emerged from her house. Elizabeth, Beth, she called, hurrying over. She pressed a small package into Beth's hands. Your mother's Bible. She gave it to me before she passed. Asked me to hold it for you. Said you'd know when you needed it. Beth's composure finally cracked. She clutched the worn leather book, feeling her mother's presence like a benediction. Thank you, she whispered. She was proud of you. You know, Mrs., Harper said softly. Even then, she knew you were meant for something more than this town could offer. She glanced at Caleb. You take care of her, Mr. Riker. With my life, Caleb said simply. They made one last stop, the cemetery on the hill overlooking town. Beth knelt by her mother's grave, tracing the simple headstone. I'm free, Mama, she whispered. Finally free. I hope you are too. Caleb helped her to her feet, and they stood together in the fading afternoon light. Below them, Dustrock went about its business, already forgetting the scandal of the minister's daughter. Life would go on. Her father would find another wife for David Patterson. If they ever caught him, the church would persist in its certainties, but Beth and Caleb would be elsewhere, building something new. Where do we go now? She asked as they mounted their horses. Wherever you want, Caleb said. Denver's hiring teachers. Santa Fe needs mail carriers. Or we could go further. California, Oregon, anywhere you can imagine. Beth looked west, where the mountains rose like promises against the sky. Somewhere we can be ourselves. Somewhere that needs a school for children no one else will teach. I know just the place. Caleb said. Little settlement called Haven, 2 days north. Mining families, mostly. Rough people, but good hearts. They've been asking for a teacher. Haven, Beth repeated, liking the sound of it. Yes, let's go to Haven. As they rode out of Dustrock for the last time, Beth felt the weight of her old life falling away like shed skin. Her father's condemnation, the town's whispers, the narrow future that had been planned for her, all of it dissolved in the mountain air. She was Beth Riker now, wife of a man who'd seen too much but still chose gentleness, teacher-to-be for children who needed her, woman who'd claimed her own life at great cost but without regret. The sun set behind them as they climbed into the mountains, painting the sky in shades of freedom. Ahead lay Haven and the life they'd build together, imperfect, uncertain, but wholly their own. No regrets, Caleb asked, echoing his question from their first night together. None, Beth said firmly, urging her horse forward. Only possibilities. They rode into the gathering darkness, toward their future, leaving judgment and shame behind in the valley below. And for the first time in her life, Beth Whitlow Riker felt truly, completely, irrevocably alive. Spring came early to Haven that year, melting the snow from the mountain peaks and filling the streams with rushing water. Beth stood in the doorway of the small schoolhouse, watching her students scatter across the meadow for lunch. 8 months had passed since she and Caleb had arrived in the rough mining settlement, and in that time, they'd built something neither had dared imagine, a life of purpose and unexpected joy. Mrs. Beth, 7-year-old Lucy Chen tugged at her skirt, the daughter of Chinese miners. Lucy had been the first child brave enough to attend the new teacher's classes. Will you tell us more about the ocean after lunch? Of course, dear one. Beth smoothed the girl's dark hair. Have you been practicing your letters? Lucy nodded proudly, producing a slate covered in careful script. Other teachers had refused to take Chinese children, Mexican children, the daughters of saloon women. But Beth's classroom welcomed all, a radical notion that had initially shocked Haven's more conventional residents. Good work, Beth praised, sending Lucy off to play. She turned back inside to find Caleb setting down a basket of supplies on her desk. Brought lunch, he said, unpacking fresh bread from Margaret's recipe, cheese and early strawberries. Thought we could eat together. They'd established this ritual in their first weeks in Haven, a midday meal shared whenever Caleb's schedule allowed. His work had expanded beyond mail delivery. He now crafted saddles and tack for the local ranchers, his skilled hands finding new purpose in creation rather than destruction. Any news from town? Beth asked, settling beside him on the bench. Letter from your cousin, and this. He pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Came on today's stage. Beth recognized the handwriting immediately, Mrs. Harper's careful script. Inside was a brief note and a small wooden cross, worn smooth with handling. Your father left Dust Rock. The note read, took a position in Kansas. Before he left, he asked me to send you this. It was your mother's. Perhaps someday, Mrs. H. Beth turned the cross over in her hands, remembering how her mother had worn it always, fingering it during her father's longest sermons. The wood was warm, as if it still held some essence of Martha Whitlow's gentle spirit. Are you all right? Caleb asked softly. Yes. Beth was surprised to find it was true. He couldn't say it himself, couldn't write to me directly, but send in this. She tucked the cross into her pocket. Maybe it's the closest to forgiveness he can manage. Maybe it's a start. Caleb agreed. The afternoon brought a surprise visitor, Sarah McKenna, the mayor's wife and Haven's self-appointed moral guardian. She entered the schoolhouse with the air of someone performing an unpleasant duty, her nose wrinkling at the sight of Miguel Hernandez's muddy boots by the door. Mrs. Riker, she began formally. I've come about the summer festival as the school teacher. You'll be expected to organize the children's recitation. I'd be happy to, Beth said carefully. Relations with the town's proper women remained delicate. They couldn't quite condemn her. She was legally married and performed her duties well, but neither could they fully accept a woman with her scandalous history. See that you do. Mrs. McKenna's gaze swept the room, taking in the mix of children from every corner of Haven's diverse population. Though I do hope you'll encourage a more selective participation this year. All my students are welcome to participate, Beth said firmly. That's non-negotiable. The woman's lips pursed. We shall see what the committee thinks about that. She swept out, leaving disapproval in her wake like expensive perfume. Trouble? Caleb asked from the doorway. The usual, Beth sighed. She wants me to turn away half my students for the crime of being born to the wrong families. What will you do? What I always do. Ignore her. Beth's smile turned mischievous. Though I might just teach them to recite something in Spanish this year. Or Chinese. Really give her something to clutch her pearls about. Caleb laughed, the sound still rare enough to make Beth's heart lift. That's my rebel wife, still fighting the good fight. That evening, they walked home together along the creek path. Their cabin was small but solid, built with the help of grateful parents whose children now read and wrote because of Beth. Smoke already rose from the chimney. Caleb had banked the fire that morning to keep the place warm. Inside, Beth began preparing dinner while Caleb tended to evening chores. These domestic rhythms had developed naturally, without discussion. She hummed as she worked. One of her mother's hymns transformed into something lighter, less mournful. "That smells wonderful," Caleb said, coming in with an armload of firewood. "Venison stew, Mrs. Delacroix gave me her recipe. Apparently, it's an old Creole family secret." Beth smiled. "Another advantage of welcoming everyone. The French trappers' wives have the best cooking knowledge." After dinner, they sat by the fire as had become their custom. Caleb worked on a new bridle while Beth graded slates. Comfortable silence wrapping around them like a blanket. These quiet evenings were when Beth felt their connection most strongly, not in passion, though that remained, but in the simple peace of shared purpose. "I've been thinking," Caleb said suddenly, "about building an addition to the cabin." Beth looked up. "Oh? Another room, maybe two." He kept his eyes on his work, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. "For when, if we—" He stopped, started again. "In case our family grows." Beth set down her work and moved to kneel beside his chair. They'd never spoken directly about children, though she'd wondered if it was even possible after all Caleb had endured. "Is that something you want?" He finally met her eyes. "I never thought I'd want, never thought I deserved." His hand covered hers. "But watching you with those children, seeing how you've made this place a home, yes, if God sees fit to bless us that way, then we'll build the addition," Beth said simply, "and trust the rest to Providence." He pulled her up into his lap, holding her close. "How did I get so lucky? To find you, to have this life." "Not luck," Beth corrected. "Choice. We chose each other, remember? And we keep choosing, every day." Later, as they lay entwined in their bed, Beth thought about the journey that had brought them here. The frightened girl who'd bandaged a stranger's hand seemed like someone from a different lifetime. So did the broken soldier who'd thought himself beyond redemption. "Do you ever miss it?" Caleb asked in the darkness. "The certainty of your old life, always knowing what was expected, what came next?" "Never," Beth answered without hesitation. "Do you miss the solitude? The freedom of the mountain trails with no one to answer to?" "I thought I would," he admitted. "But then I come home to you, and I realize I wasn't free before. I was just empty. You filled spaces in me I didn't even know were hollow." Beth traced the scars on his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady under her palm. "We saved each other," she murmured. "No," Caleb corrected gently. "We chose each other. Like you said, that's better than saving. That's building something new." Summer arrived in full glory, and with it the festival. True to her word, Beth's students performed a multilingual program that scandalized Mrs. McKenna and delighted everyone else. Lucy Chen recited poetry in English and Chinese. Miguel Hernandez sang a Spanish ballad. Even shy Emma Thompson, daughter of the town's most notorious saloon girl, found her voice for a stirring rendition of Amazing Grace. Afterward, as families gathered for the dance, old Samuel McCready approached Beth with a package. "Came through the mail special," he said. "Marked urgent." Inside was a letter from Margaret and a smaller envelope with familiar handwriting. Her father's. Beth's hands trembled as she opened it. "Elizabeth," it began. "Not daughter, but not Mrs. Riker either. A small progress. I have learned of your work in Haven. While I cannot condone the path that brought you there, I am told you teach with compassion and wisdom. Your mother would have been—" Here the ink was smudged, as if he'd paused long in writing. "Your mother would have recognized herself in your choices. I pray for you daily. Though we may not meet again in this life, I hope we shall be reconciled in the next. Your father, Josiah Whitlow. P.S. The Church Council has agreed to send books for your school. Knowledge, at least, should know no boundaries." Beth read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. Not forgiveness. Exactly. But acknowledgement? Perhaps that was enough. "Good news?" Caleb asked, appearing at her elbow with cups of cider. Unexpected news. She showed him the letter. My father's learning to bend, it seems. And you? How does it make you feel? Beth considered. Grateful. Not for his approval. I don't need that anymore. But grateful he's finding his own way to peace. She tucked the letter away. Now, husband mine, I believe you promised me a dance. They joined the other couples as the fiddle struck up a reel. Haven's rough miners and their wives made space for them, accepting what Dustrock never could, that love came in many forms. Redemption had many faces, and sometimes the best families were the ones you chose to build. As they danced under the stars, Beth caught sight of their cabin on the hill, windows glowing warm with lamplight. Home. Not the home she'd been raised to want, but the one she'd fought to create. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, it always did. But tonight, there was music and laughter, and Caleb's arms around her. I love you, she said, the words still feeling like freedom every time she spoke them. And I love you, he replied, spinning her until her skirts flared and she laughed with pure joy. My wild Beth, my choosing and chosen wife. The mountains stood witness to their happiness, ancient and enduring. And somewhere in the summer darkness, Beth could almost hear her mother's voice on the wind, singing the old lullabies with new words, songs of courage and choice and love that conquered fear. They'd traveled far from that foggy morning in Dustrock, when a minister's daughter bandaged a soldier's wounded hand. But every step had led them here, to this moment, to this life they'd built from ashes and hope. And oh, it was good. The end. Thank you so much for joining me on Beth and Caleb's journey through the untamed Colorado frontier. I hope their story of forbidden love, courage, and redemption touched your heart as much as it did mine. Where are you listening to this tale tonight? Drop a comment below and let me know. I love connecting with fellow lovers of Western romance from all corners of the world. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales of passion and adventure in the American frontier. And share your thoughts about Beth and Caleb's choices. Did you root for them from the beginning? What moment made you believe in their love? Let's discuss in the comments below.